Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, I thought we'd talk a little bit about independent MPs and the role that they play in our parliament. The news, of course, was that Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould both decided that they were going to run as independents in the next election and not as members of another party such as the Greens. And I thought I'd take a minute to really kind of explain what that looks like in a system like ours and why that's can be important. One of the things that you'll always hear me say is that when you go to a voting booth, you always mark your name for the person, not necessarily the party or the leader. That may be your intention when you go in to vote, but the actual vote is for the person, and that matters a lot in a system like ours. That means that if there's an issue and the MP will decide to leave caucus or cross the floor, or in this case they were expelled from caucus, that MP still has their powers as an MP. And that's something that we really need to remember is important in our system because that is the basis by which all of the kind of powers and privileges stem from. Well, we give a lot of power to individual MPs. We also can't forget that parties exist for a reason, and that reason is for confidence. Anything that happens in a system like ours requires a majority of the House of Commons in order to agree. And confidence being the notion that the party that holds power has enough votes to get their program through. And that's important in the way in which parliaments are constructed and in which how power flows. In a system like ours, parties ensure that there are enough votes to ensure confidence. And this has kind of evolved a little bit over time, and power has become centralized in various ways, largely because of the way in which our parties have become more leader-centric. And that's something we need to also remember when we talk about any kind of democratic malaise around parties. And I think that when we look at the situation around Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott and this, malaise around parties on the other side, we need to remember that there is kind of a give and take on both of those aspects. One of the things that most people think about independent MPs is that wouldn't it be great if we didn't have parties anymore? But that kind of thinking doesn't really understand how confidence works. And there are these notions that if we could get them all just to sit down and talk out issues and so on, that we would all cooperate and everything would be great. But the problem with that is, one, there will always be fundamental disagreements. Two, factionalism will happen whether they are as a defined party or not. And three, one of the reasons why parties do exist is for that kind of internal horse trading to take place in order for you to get sufficient coalitions to be able to vote. It's really what a party is a coalition of individual MPs that band together in order to ensure that a program can go through. There may be individual differences between them, but those tend to get papered over in various degrees. Some parties are very hardline about ensuring that everyone's in lockstep. Other parties are a little less so. And that's one of the kind of dynamics that we have to really think about in terms of how we conceptualize our parliament and how parties work. The other thing I think we need to remember when it comes to this notion that it would be great if we didn't have parties is what it would take for a government to form and for confidence to be achieved. And that inevitably would mean some kind of vote buying among the MPs. And this is something that I did talk about in my book, The Unbroken Machine. And that is the notion that if you didn't have these parties already and these coalition of MPs, that it would inevitably wind up becoming an exercise in whoever forms the government needing to buy off the MPs that they need in order to get their program past the House. And that could mean things like, infrastructure projects in those ridings or, specific programs that they are particularly interested in or have a great deal of passion around. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we don't necessarily want this coalition of loose, or a parliament of loose fish, as John A. Macdonald used to call it. So what that inevitably means is that you need some kind of structure in order for that kind of disciplining of power to take place. And we get really upset about the talk about, party whips and so on, but there is a certain amount of necessity around it in order to keep an organized structure. There are 338 seats in the House of Commons, and that means that there are a lot of, disparate forces to really kind of manage. And it's difficult to do that if you don't have any kind of structure around that. If you have 338 individuals who all want something in order for support, it can spin things out of control really quickly. The other thing to remember is that when you've got a number of disparate small groups, that kind of vote buying among coalitions can also become problematic in different regards, whether it's we've seen in some countries where hardline elements who have a certain number of votes that a government needs will be able to push their agenda far more effectively than more big tent or centrist or less extreme parties would be able to. So when it comes to individual MPs who are sitting as independents in the House of Commons, they are at a disadvantage in a certain number of ways. They don't have guaranteed spots when it comes to speaking times on bills. They do when it comes to member statements and questions in question period. And in fact, some independents get a lot more time in question period than they would if they were in the backbench of a party. But when it comes to things like committee work, which is the heart of Parliament, where all the real work happens, there isn't a place for individual MPs as independents in that process, because in order to ensure that you've got proper balance on all of the various committees, you need to have a minimum number of MPs in your caucus in order to ensure that they can be spread around effectively. I think it would be a lot more problematic if the rules changed so that independent MPs could sit on whichever committee, and not necessarily have their own outlook across the various committees. And logistically that can't happen. And while there is some room in the standing orders to accommodate that around amendments, which there's been some particular monkeying around of in the last couple of parliaments thanks to some procedural shenanigans that were played, I think we need to remember that they do have an opportunity to speak, but it is less so than they would as part of a party. There are certain disadvantages for people running as independents as well, in that they don't have access to the same kind of tax credits or infrastructure when it comes to parties and volunteers and so on. It becomes much more of a almost labor of love, and in some cases it can happen and does work, but not always. Some examples where independents did get elected in previous parliaments was because they didn't have their main party opposition or who they were somewhat aligned with running against them. That's not the case with Wilson-Raybould or Philpott, where the Liberals fully intend to run someone against them. And the most we've heard is that the Greens have, or Elizabeth May in any case, has suggested that the Greens may perhaps run a paper candidate against them, but not someone who's going to actively campaign. Just ensuring that they've got a name on the ballot so that they can get all of their Elections Canada tax credits and so on, and their the maximized spending limits. Since Wilson-Raybould and Philpott made the announcement, a lot of the rhetoric has been around how they could possibly play an outsized influence role if the next parliament happens to be a minority. While that is a theoretical possibility, it's a particularly small one in order to hang any kind of real hopes on going into it. Well, we have seen a number of very tight minorities in some of the provinces. I don't know that the electoral math necessarily works out the same way federally. Having these two run as independents in this hope is a very big gamble, and I think it's one that we should, keep in mind when we think about, what kind of message they're trying to send as independents. Both of them have talked about doing politics differently, but I don't know that they necessarily understand how the system actually works as it is now in order for them to have any kind of influence in a future parliament. I know that Philpott in particular has been speaking to certain activists who think that a parliament with more independence would be a great thing. But again, I don't know that there is necessarily enough understanding about the dynamics in how a responsible government system works for that to really be an effective tool at making any kind of change. After all, one of the biggest problems with the way our system's functioning right now is the leadership system. It's not the parties so much as it is the way in which we choose leaders. And that's not something that independent MPs are going to be able to have any kind of influence on. In fact, MPs within a party would be able to have far more influence on that kind of an issue than they would from the outside. And that's one of the things I think we need to keep in mind. That we're diagnosing the right problem instead of, pinning our hopes on something that is necessarily not the right avenue to address the problems that are. So with this in mind, I think it's going to be an interesting experience for the rest of us to watch as these two try and make their marks as independents. We'll see if there's any kind of uptake in their local ridings for their message. But again, we should remember that in the broader context of, how our system is working and how it's designed to work, that the influence of independence is necessarily small, and really for good reason when we look about the dynamics of how governments form. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale. That's at Journo_Dale on Twitter. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.